feel like I've been to church. You don't really need anybody. Why don't you just stay and pray for a while? I do get questioned every once. She said, "You're Charlie Jones." I said, "My wife is Sally Jones." And people wonder. We've been married 41 years. We go to a hotel. They go, "Charlie and Sally Jones." They go, "Yeah, sure." And especially when they look at her and then they look at me, they just sort of shake their head. I'm glad to be able to. Well, they called it. I'm just teaching a class next door at 11, so this is it's fun for me to come just over next door and be able to teach, and I'm glad to be here today. It's Wally sends me all these little instructions about what's going to happen in the class, and he always says, he said, "We're going to pray, we're going to do this." But David always opens with a joke, and it's usually senior related. For a while, I said,
Always.
"So you're pretty senior today when the guy's dead." So it's good to know. It's good to know folks when you come in and feel a little more comfortable. I've known Nick for a while. Nick knew that I was going to teach today, so we happened to pull up in the parking lot at the same time today. And I guess, kept wondering why Nick was still sitting in his car, and I get out, I guess Nick, knowing that I was going to teach, all of a sudden he's coming at me with the car, and I went, "Nick, it's okay, it's all right." Missed again, But when I was handing out the papers, I was trying to give them two, and Nick says, "We only need one, we share." But it reminded me of this story of this elderly couple who, they looked a little poor, and they weren't doing real well coming into McDonald's, and coming in to have their lunch, and this young man was sitting in McDonald's, and he watched this event as they came into McDonald's. So they come in, they order one Happy Meal, one fry, one Coke, and a cheeseburger, and get an extra cup. So they go back to their seat, and so he cuts the cheeseburger in half and everything, and the guy starts to eat. The man starts to eat, and the woman is watching him eat. And so the young guy said, "I can't stand any longer. I got to find out what the deal is with this couple." So he goes over to this couple and he said, "Listen, I've seen watched you there, and you look very sweet and everything. And can you tell me your story?" She said, "Oh yes." Well, he said, "We've been married for 50 years, and we just love each other. We share everything we have." And he says, "Well, that's wonderful, ma'am. That's so very romantic, but why aren't you eating?" She said, "Well, it's his turn to use the teeth." Reminded me of sharing the story. We've been studying. We've been studying, and this goes really well with my lesson today. We've been studying through the book of Ecclesiastes, and I know some classes have taken a few chapters and they've skipped around and done some other stuff, and that's good. And I think it's whatever works and whatever the Lord leads you to do. I know that's good. We're going to study chapter 9 today. There's only chapter 9, and then next Sunday is chapter 10, and then the last Sunday on Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and 12. But we're going to take chapter 9 today, and Ecclesiastes is a difficult book to teach, to understand, to go through and try to get the most out of it, because Solomon is at the very last part of his life. Solomon wrote 3 books, right? We believe that he wrote the majority or all of 3 books. So what would those 3 books be? Proverbs, right? That's the easy one. What's another one he wrote? They're all right next together. Ecclesiastes, we believe he wrote this book, and what's the last one? Song of Solomon. There you go, Song of Solomon. Now, if you look at it, he probably wrote those books. He probably wrote Song of Solomon early on in his life, and it's a book of romance. Then he wrote the book of Proverbs, which is a book of rules. And this works if you do this, and this works, and this works. This is wisdom. But then, late in life, he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And it's really a book of regrets. Because Solomon, as you know, he had everything, right? But Solomon had a problem, and he decided that he would get married 700 times. And so he had 700 wives, 1 Kings 11 tells us, and 300 concubines. The guy in my class told me last Sunday that the problem was that he had 700 mother-in-laws. And I don't know, that's probably true. But it also said that from that point on, that Solomon's heart turned away from the Lord. And we believe at the end of Solomon's life, because he set up idol worship and so on, that he really fell far away from where he was when he asked God for wisdom, and God granted him wisdom, and along with that, great riches and wealth and possessions as he led the nation of Israel. But as you go through the book of Ecclesiastes, he looks at things from one perspective. And a good way to remember it is to think of it this way. He looked at everything. One of the key phrases in the book of Ecclesiastes is under the sun, right? And so the way he looked at things was always on a horizontal perspective. He looked at things from man's perspective. He never had the vertical perspective in the first 8 or 9 chapters. And from God's perspective, things look a lot different, don't they? But he just looked at things, and that's why he said everything is vanity. Everything is meaningless. Nothing has any purpose in life. If you look at it from man's perspective, that's what you get. But if you put God's perspective in, then that's when we start to see purpose. And that's what he begins to address in chapter 8 and 9, and really gets into it next week in chapter 10. He sort of turns the corner. There's a lot about dying in this chapter. That's a happy thought, isn't it? Most people don't want to talk a lot about dying, but Solomon talks about it. We'd rather talk about living. So Solomon begins by talking about those who fear dying, and he talks about the absolute certainty of death, and that it's the same for the rich, the poor, and the sick, and the well, and the religious, and the irreligious, and the clean, and the unclean. It's expected for everyone. And so the modern day philosopher would say, and I'll quote one of those great theologians, Woody Allen. He said, I'm not afraid of death. He said, I just don't want to be there when it happens. Right? You've heard him say that? So, and it's like that tombstone in Indiana. Some of you have seen this and heard about this. The tombstone, actually, it does say this. It says, pause, stranger, as you pass me by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you will be. So prepare for death and follow me. And then somebody came in and wrote after that, some brave soul wrote on the tombstone, to follow you I'm not content until I know which way you went. So he got the crux of what Solomon's trying to talk about today, that we all face the reality and the certainty of death. Now, he said, in the first really 6-7 chapters, he said, I've tried all these things. And I've tried everything to bring me pleasure, to bring me joy and happiness. I tried pleasure, I've tried money, I've tried politics and power and food and wine. And actually, in I think chapter 3, I've tried purpose. And so today, he said, let's talk about that a little bit. Let me give you an outline. This is a verse that we're using in the last chapter. When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter, he's doing an investigation, right? He's looking at all this stuff to see what's going to work. And he said, but when I've done all of my work, he said, this is what I found out. Fear God and keep his commandments, because this is all humanity. God will bring every act to judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil. Now, in this chapter, you got a pretty simple outline. We all have a common destiny. So based on that, here's some advice for living. And then I'm going to add even more to that foundation and give you just some statements of wisdom. So, let's look at verse 1. Verse 1. He's going to start off, he said, we have a common destiny, and that everything is in the sovereign hand of God. Look at verse 1. This too I carefully explored. Even though the actions of godly and wise men are in God's hand, no one knows whether God will show them favor. Francis Schaeffer, most of you heard of, a theologian and a philosopher, said God is there and he is not silent because he is in control. That's what Solomon is saying. He's in control. God has his hands on control and everything is in his sovereign hand. So when he says that wise people are in God's hands, he said if you view life under the sun, this is what you see. It's unpredictable and it's precarious. And everything happens by chance or coincidence. But Solomon said, if you view things from God's perspective, instead of unpredictable, it's providential. Instead of precarious, it's purposeful. And that everything is based on the sovereign control of God. So, that's one thing he said, first thing you can be sure of. Now, the next thing is verses 2 and 3, where he says, this is where he gets to the reality of, or certainty of death, all right? Verses 2 and 3. The same destiny ultimately awaits everyone, whether righteous or wicked, good or bad, ceremonial, clean or unclean, religious or irreligious. Good people receive the same treatment as sinners, and people who make promises to God are treated as people who don't. It seems so wrong that everyone under the sun suffers the same fate. Already twisted by evil, people choose their own mad course, for they have no hope. There is nothing ahead but death anyway. Well, that's an encouraging passage, isn't it? And really, that's the philosophy of the world, isn't it? There's nothing else. This is it. Death is it. And so Solomon is giving the view again under the sun. This is the world, the humanistic approach to life and to death. But he's saying you can count on it happening. And it happens to the rich, and it happens to the poor, and to the religious, and to the irreligious, and so on. It's no respecter of persons. A week ago Saturday, I'd mown the lawn, and I finished mowing the lawn. I came inside the house, and my wife, Sally Jones, and so she was sitting at the table doing one of her art projects and everything. And on Saturday, she always has the TV running for noise. She's not watching it. She watches the cooking programs first, and then the rest of it's noise to keep her while she's working on her different projects. And I can't even explain what some of them are. But so she's working on this project. And what my favorite show as a teenager, my very favorite show. And as soon as I put this up, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah.
My favorite is all day showing of Hogan's Heroes. All day. And I looked at that and I love this show. And Bob Crane and it was Hogan and Warner Klemper was Colonel Klink and Schultz and all of these guys. And as I looked at that, I started thinking about this. I said, Bob Crane, dead. Warner Klemper, Colonel Klink is dead. John Banner, I know nothing, he's dead. Richard Dawson, who went on to do Family Feud, remember? He's dead. And I went down the line, Ivan Dixon, Larry Hovis, all these guys. I knew who they were, I knew all about them. You don't want to know all about Bob Crane, bad guy. But so if you don't know what all it is about Bob Crane, there's a movie about him. You go watch it. You'll wish you had enough. Now, as as I was looking at that, I said, you know, Sal, this is really amazing. When I was watching this as a kid, loved this show, but I thought these guys were immortal. I just thought that they would always be around. And as I look, it just really hit me when it's odd, but when I looked at that, they're all dead except one guy. Does anybody know who's still alive? This little guy right here. LeBeau. Remember the French guy, LeBeau? He's 95 years old. He's the only guy that's alive out of that show, of the major stars in that show. And I thought, you know, it made me stop and think about the certainty of death. And just as a young teenager, I thought, man, these guys are they're going to be on TV forever. We're going to have Hogan's Heroes forever. But we didn't, did we? And they're all gone. So, let me go ahead. Look at verse 4. Verse 4, 5, and 6. Solomon moves on and says, you know, from man's perspective again, there's hope, but only for the living. There's hope only for the living. As they say, it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. Now, has anybody ever used that as before and said, boy, I get up this morning, it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion? Haven't used that one. I've got up and said, it's good to be horizontal. Or I've said, I'm glad my eyes opened this morning. But back then, this was a fairly commonly used Hebrew idiom, which meant, you know, I'd rather be a live dog, which was, dogs were hated. They were wicked, vile, dirty animals. They weren't like our little lap dogs that we had. And they didn't like them. And they said, but it's better, Solomon said, to be one of those vile things than the majesty of the lion, which they had the greatest respect for, and be dead. So it makes a pretty good, you probably won't use it. You know, David, you're probably not going to use that next week, are you? When somebody says, how you feel, it's better to be
I'll wait a couple of weeks.
You wait a couple of weeks. Yeah. It's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. You might get a few looks if you use that. Then he goes on, he says, the living at least, they know they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward, nor they remembered whatever they did in their lifetime, loving, hating, envying is all gone. They no longer play a part in anything here on earth. So, once again, he's asking a question, a couple of questions. And, you know, I didn't put this in the notes or anything, so you may want to add to it just to remind yourself of what I think he's getting at. Good question for us. How many people live well, and then how many people die well? I became very aware of this issue of, excuse me, I gotta take this off, I'm about to die. And it won't be well. I became acutely aware of this issue of dying well. And the older we get, the more aware we become of dying well. I'm going to use that phrase for a few minutes and I'll explain myself. Over the past almost exactly 5.5 years. And it started right when we began our life group. And shortly afterwards, as a matter of fact, in the end of October, we started August, the end of October, my younger brother suddenly died of a heart attack. And then not too long after that, a young lady that, a man and woman had joined our class, and a young lady in there, she was in her late 40s, early 50s, I believe. He came home from work, and she was laying in the floor, and she had died, heart attack. And then shortly after that, my father died. Then shortly after that, my 51-year-old son-in-law died. And then shortly after that, one of my dearest friends, who led our men's ministry in our class, he died. And so, for every one of them. And as I was thinking through it, somebody sent me, and I was going to bring it this morning, I didn't do it. Somebody sent me a book, or gave me a book, I don't even remember where I got it. It's called Preparing for Heaven. It's a book by a guy named Gary Black. And Gary Black the subtitle of the book is What Dallas Willard Taught Me About Living, Dying, and Eternal Life. Now you may have heard of Dallas Willard. He was a famous theologian and teacher and philosopher and just a great Christian leader. And Gary Black was a student of his at Fuller Theological Seminary. And so I was reading this book, and I didn't know, to be honest with you, I didn't know much about either one of them. But I'd heard some things about Dallas Willard, but I didn't ever studied anything from him. What happened is that late in life, Dallas Willard got very, very, very ill. And he knew he wasn't, unless the Lord intervened in some way, he was not going to live. I think it might have been pancreatic cancer. So he asked, who was now grown, but in a ministry himself, he asked if Gary would be interested in sort of sticking around with him while he passed away, with his family and everything else. So Gary said, I'm going to chronicle his passing over an extended period of time. To begin that, though, he has a chapter that is called A Good Death. And it talks about dying well. And listen to what Dallas Willard said when he introduced his class. He had a 2-week doctrinal dissertation study with students. And this is how, and Gary Black was in that class, and then he wrote about it in this book. This is how he introduced his class. He did it as a prayer. And he stood up and he put his hands up over the class. And he said, I pray that you would have a rich life of joy and power, abundant and supernatural results, with a constant, clear vision of never-ending life in God's world before you and the everlasting significance of your work day by day. A radiant life and a radiant death. When he approached death, there's several chapters of things that he said as he was approaching death. But one of the things is that he said right before he died to Gary was, he said, Gary, he said, don't fret. It's all right. This is just the end of the beginning for me. And that's what I mean. I think that's what Solomon couldn't see from man's perspective was a good death. This is just the end for Christians. This is just the end of our beginning. And as I thought back over these people that I mentioned, and I read that, I said, you know what? This was just, in each case, this was just the end of their beginning. Look at let's go to verses 7 and through 10. Now, that's the thing I just quoted to you. You could tell that I usually have somebody do this for me. I don't do it very well. I'm almost hopeless here. Advice for living, in verse 7, 8, 9, and 10. Let's read that. Go eat your food with gladness, and drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God has always approved what you do. Those non-denominational folks, not the Baptists, but the non-denominational folks, always like that, drink your wine. I won't say more about that. Tommy and I used to talk about that all the time. And he said the Baptists would never agree to that. Verse 8, always be clothed in white, and always anoint your head with oil. Now this sounds a lot different than the verses before, doesn't it? So he goes on, he says, enjoy life with your wife, whom you love, all the days of your meaningless life that God has given you under the sun, all your meaningless days. That's encouraging. Go ahead and enjoy your living with your wife, and it's meaningless anyway. For this is your lot in life, and your toilsome labor under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For in the realm of the dead, where you're going, there is neither working nor planning nor knowledge nor wisdom. And if you don't keep this in mind, this passage, just like the rest of the book, it just messes you up. It doesn't make sense. But it makes a lot of sense if that's all you're looking from man's perspective, and not including God's intervention in our life and bringing purpose to our life. So, and he's pretty clear here. I like how he begins verse 7. Go ahead, enjoy your life. Some Christians need to be told that. Go ahead, enjoy the gift that God has given you of life. And he goes, if you ever want to pick up a book and understand a lot more about Ecclesiastes, I encourage you to get Chuck Swindoll's book that he wrote, I think in the 70s. It's Living on the Ragged Edge is the name of the book. Very good book by Chuck Swindoll. In chapter 9, the chapter on this his commentary on this chapter is entitled, Have a Blast While It Lasts. That's a good way to look at it. Solomon's advice here is to live life to the fullest. Let me ask you a quick question. How many of you, and you'd be willing to admit it, how many of you either have written it down or at least mentally you have some kind of bucket list? Raise your hand. All right. Will any of you tell me what's on your bucket list? Just one thing. What's on your bucket list?
Right, well, it was on my bucket list, and I did it, but I'll never go back and do it again.
Don't tell me that was marriage. No, I'm not.
Jumping off an airplane. I will never.
Jumping off an airplane.
Yeah, no, never.
God
That was
bless
on
you.
my bucket list.
Yeah.
But, no, I don't want to ever do that again.
You know, that's on my youngest daughter's
Well, you're right.
bucket list. Not on
Young
mine.
kids
Oh, no.
like it.
I told her, I said, don't you ever do that. I said, if you do it, don't tell me. I
No,
don't want
young
to know
kids
about it.
love
I don't
it.
want pictures. I don't want anything. God bless you. What else? Anybody else have one on?
Ken?
Ken?
What do you have?
I'd like to go to Normandy and Haiti as well.
Okay, all right. Good bucket list items. What do you think about bucket lists? Good idea? Not a good idea?
Good idea.
Good idea. I think so. I think he's talking about some of that stuff. Bucket list. I think Christians have a little bit different bucket list than others. But I had a couple of things on my bucket list. Jumping on an airplane's not one of them. I had a bucket list item was to play on a certain golf course. And then my wife gave me that for many years ago for my 50th birthday. She gave me a trip to play at Pebble Beach. And I got to play at Pebble Beach. I got to be embarrassed on one of the most beautiful courses. Another thing that was on my bucket list was to go to the Holy Land. And I got to do that. And so, I like the bucket list idea. The reason I say that, in our class here today, when we're talking about it, the reason I say that is because I think, and I have to be careful what I say in my class because they record it and give it to and I play it for my mother. So I have to be very careful what I say. I don't have to worry about that. And if you send this to my mother, I'll tell them that you lied and you edited the tape. But I was raised in a great Christian home. And my father's with Jesus, and he lived for the Lord all his life. And they were married for 60-something years, and just great Christians. And my mother is just, she lives with us, and just a sweet lady that, loves the Lord. But growing up, we grew up in a rules house. And I was not really a rules guy. I still have a little bit of problem with some rules, but I wasn't really a rules guy, and so, and he was right. I know he was right, but it took me a long time to admit it. But you know what happened is, and it was not, some of you know what I'm talking about. I think we bring up I was counseling one of our kids the other day about bring up kids. There has to be grace and truth. There has to be a balance of strength and beauty. Jesus was a perfect example of that, right? And in the home, there has to be, from the parent to the child, and I didn't do this very well. I was probably much more truth than grace. But my dad, God bless him, and loved Jesus, but he was all truth. with no grace. And ultimately, that changed. I changed, and you know what? He changed a lot too. And so that shifted around. But one of the things that I got out of that I had to, and I went to a church, growing up in church, and the church was very, very strict. Good gospel preaching church. I got saved in the church, wonderful church. But part of the problem with the church is that they almost taught that it was sinful to enjoy the Christian life, and that we're really called to endure the Christian life. And I think the balance that Solomon brings, even from this perspective in this passage, is to enjoy our Christian life, and to have a bucket list, and to have things that we're thankful for, that God puts in our way. Can I just give you a quick paraphrase of those verses? He said 4 areas of life, and he said, eat every meal as if you were at a banquet. Celebrate every day as if you were at a party. Enjoy marriage as if you were on your honeymoon. Share your teeth. Work as if it was your final work day. Now that is, he's not saying enjoy every pleasure and sinful fleshly desire and revel in unbridled passion and hedonism and without regard to the will of God. He said enjoy the gift of life that God gives you. What does that look like for the Christian? I'll quote out of that book, The Ragged Edge. Here's what Swindoll said. What does that look like for the Christian to enjoy the gift of life? Being, I don't know if I have that or not. Probably not. Oh, I did have that though. Anyway, I don't know what I got. Here's what he said. He said, what does it look like for a Christian? Be free of guilt. Be contagiously happy. Be committed to God and to your marriage, and thoroughly involved in what the Lord has planned for you. That's what I believe, enjoying the gift of life that God has given you. Okay, let's finish up. Statements of wisdom, verses 11 through 18. Let's just read verses 11 and 12 quick. I have seen something else under the sun. The race is not to the swift, the battle of the strong, nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned, but time and chance happen to them all. Moreover, no one knows when their hour will come. All fish are caught in a cruel net, or birds are taken in a snare. So people are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them. So verse 11 and 12 teaches us that it's vain to trust in human qualities rather than in God's sovereignty. The best example I can give you is sort of one of my favorite stories as a kid, and that was the story of Jim Thorpe. I mean, I'm talking about Jim Thorpe. All right, Jim Thorpe. I don't know if I saw the movie first or if I read the book first, but I did both, and I loved it. And Jim Thorpe was one of my childhood heroes. Jim Thorpe was a Native American, and he was one of the most incredible athletes that ever lived. He was a charter member of the Football Hall of Fame. He played Major League Baseball for an outfielder for the New York Giants, for the Cincinnati Reds, and for the Boston Braves. He was a member of the College Hall of Fame. He was a charter member of the Olympic Hall of Fame. He was named America's greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century. But what do we remember? He won 2 gold medals at the 1912 Olympic Games. But when it was discovered that he had played baseball for $5 a season, he was stripped of his Olympic titles because he did not have amateur status any longer when he competed in the Olympics. And then in 1983, 30 years after he died, the Olympic Committee, International Olympic Committee, changed their mind and gave the family the gold medals. That's one of the saddest stories I've ever heard. And when I was a kid, I heard all that. I just hated that. And when I was a kid, he hadn't gotten his gold medals back yet. He died in 1953. That doesn't sit with well. Things are supposed to be fair. Have you ever wondered, I started thinking about this week, why do we see what Solomon says here, that the worst sometimes happens to the best, and we're upset by the iniquity? And we say, you know, life cheats sometimes. It's just not fair. So let me ask this group of people in here. Why do we feel that way? Why do we get upset? And I think most of us, when we heard this story, or heard it today maybe for the first time, but most of us have heard the story of Jim Thorpe. It upsets you that they took away his gold medal. Why? Why? Why does it upset us? Have you ever thought about that? Why does it upset you?
He worked so hard to get there.
He worked hard to get there. It was unfair. Why do we get so offended? Even as Christians, why do we get so offended? It wasn't fair. All of us feel that way, don't we? We want things to be fair. Why do we feel that way?
Well, you know what, even when we didn't really, when I didn't really understand as much about the sovereignty of God, you know, and then even after you do, you still like, well, that's not fair.
That's not fair.
Life ain't fair.
Yes, ma'am.
I just said life ain't fair.
Life ain't fair. That's about as deep as you need to get. But why does it make me feel bad? I thought about it a lot this week. Here's why. Let me offer you a possibility. Because we are made in the image of God, the God of justice. We have our Father's eyes and heart. We were created. See, track with me on this. We were created for a heaven of pure rightness and equity and fairness and justice. Solomon said it back in chapter 3. We have eternity in our heart. We are made as Christians for heaven where life is fair, but we must settle for earth. Jesus understands the unfairness of life better than anyone, because his crucifixion was the ultimate unfairness. And the night before his arrest, he told his disciples not to put their hope or trust in the world. He said we might seek heaven on earth, but our true home is with him. So Solomon said in chapter 3, verse 11, he hath placed and planted eternity in the human heart. Then the last verses, and I'm out of time, so I'll just go through this. I have seen something else under the sun. The race is not the swift, the battle of the strong. I already read that? I thought I did. I also saw under the sun that this example of wisdom that greatly impressed me. There was once a small city. It tells a story. It's a small city, few people in it. Big king comes, surrounds it, builds he's going to attack it. And then there was this little city, a little poor man, but he was wise. He saved the city by his wisdom. And then nobody remembered that poor little guy. And he said, wisdom is better than strength, but the poor man's wisdom is despised, his words are no longer heeded. The anonymous and the unappreciated. Wisdom was better than strength, but even then, his wisdom was not appreciated. The quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one center destroys much good. So, I give you just a couple of statements, and I'm done. Death is unavoidable. Life is unpredictable from this view. But Christians, we don't live on explanations. We live on promises. Back to what you were saying. We don't live on explanations. You know, John 6:35, one of my favorite verses of Scripture, is all the Father giveth to me shall come to me, and him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. You know, it doesn't say you've got to understand theology and soteriology and eschatology and things to come and the doctrine of the Trinity, and then maybe we'll figure things out. And God said, no, I'll explain all that to you. You can't comprehend it in your finite mind, but he said, I will make you a promise. I'll make you a promise that if you come to me, I'll give you eternal life. And he said, that's what you need to accept. And Solomon said, we're all under the sun, we're all trying to search for that answer. And God says, I've got the answer, but he said, I want you to have faith in the answer. And I'm not asking you to have an educated assumption about me. I'm asking you to have faith in me that only I can produce. And that makes me understand it a lot better. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for the time.